what we're really going to be talking about today is what distributed energy resources mean and how different major stakeholders in the electrical grid, and really focused on California, are attacking that in different ways. We have a great set of panelists here today, and they'll introduce themselves in a second. What I want to just set up very clearly is that what is unique about this group is we have, and I don't mean this in any harm, we have two investor-owned utilities represented here and their parent companies. So you guys kind of have dual hats. We have a community choice aggregator utility, which is a relatively new entity in California. And we have the independent system operator. It is rare to get this diversity in a room together on friendly terms. There's right, but we're really, I look forward to having the conversation. So real quick, I'm Noah Goldstein from Navigant. We're an energy consulting company. I lead strategy associated with things like distributed energy resources. I'm based in San Francisco. Happy to be here. So what we'll do is we'll go down the line really quickly, talk about who they are, what they do, and what their organizations does. That's two different things they'll be mentioning. When we get to Jan, we'll put up a slide so she can do a little bit more education. And then when we get to Lorenzo, we're actually going to start diving into some of the more technology behind distributed energy resources. So Dan, take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Noah. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you today and with this esteemed panel. I feel fortunate to be here. These very experienced folks. Myself, I was really only just invited because Noah and my son play soccer together. So I think he was looking to round out the panel. And
that's what it is. Yeah, I need a ride next Wednesday.
Right. I am the director of business intelligence within our corporate strategy group at PG&E. I think most of you, if not all, know who PG&E is. We are a gas and electric utility serving about 16 million people in Northern California. Our headquarters are just down the road in San Francisco. We're very happy to be involved here today. So as a company, we are, I think, experiencing a lot of change as a company and industry. And when we look at that, both in my work and throughout the company, we think about that change across a few key drivers. One being policy, another technology changes, and the third being customer preferences. When it comes to policy, in California, as people have already touched on today, the clear North Star we have is around climate change and greenhouse gas reduction policies. I think in California, we can really be proud of the results that we're seeing and the impact we're having. For PG&E today, 70% of our energy we supply is greenhouse gas free. And I believe that is the cleanest, or at least among the cleanest in the country. And about a third of our energy comes from renewable resources that we have signed up for under renewable portfolio standards. Today, we're operating towards hitting a 50% renewables target by 2030. We're well on the way, in fact, ahead of schedule to hit that target. So much so that now there is interest within the legislature to accelerate those targets and potentially put a marker out there for 100% renewables at some point. So that's kind of the largest scale renewables that we see. At the same time, those reductions in technology costs and increasing desire among our customers for choice and control are leading to a rapid increase in the amount of distributed energy resources we see. So PG&E has about 300,000 customers with rooftop solar, for example. We have about 150,000 customers in our territory that have electric vehicles. We see a rapid increase in the amount of battery storage, energy efficiency, and so all those resources are coming into play at a much more distributed level. And as a result, our business, our company is changing the way we operate, and the management of the grid is becoming much more complicated. That presents both challenges and opportunities. Today, we're looking at testing the ways in which we can use those distributed resources to both benefit end customers and benefit the grid. And this dynamic system that we see is really has the potential to really drive forward the progress that we've made in California towards hitting our ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals.
Great, thanks.
Good afternoon. My name is Doug Kim. I'm the Director of Technology Strategy for Edison International, which is the holding company of Southern California Edison. Prior to this job, I was actually responsible. I was in the utility, SCE, until about 6 months ago, actually. I was responsible for SCE's advanced technology, which is looking at all aspects of technology, all the way from integration of very large renewables, energy storage, electric transportation, demand response, energy efficiency technology, and so on and so forth, cybersecurity and cloud. So we are the organization that was responsible to identify and, if needed, develop those solutions that we can leverage to do some of the things that Dan just talked about. And I just realized that there's a benefit in going second because you cover a lot of these things. So I don't have to talk as long. But I did notice that you started to say that PG&E was the biggest, clean, and then you kind of pause and you go, one of the biggest. I think you were trying not to hurt my feelings, but certainly we're comparable, right? It's a large number of solar rooftops, large number, and those numbers grow something like around 5,000 every month, right? Electric cars, again, large number of electric cars in our service territory. A lot of demand response. So there's all sorts of technologies, right? Energy storage, we are on path to get 580 megawatts of energy storage. We have personally tested, developed some of the largest lithium-ion storage years ago, 32 megawatt hours in Tehachapi. We have recently put in like Tesla's storage, which was, I think, 28 megawatt, 80 megawatt hours. Big systems, right? So we had a lot of experience. We fundamentally believe that technology is one of the key enablers in terms of what the society is trying to do, what the customers want to do. And at the end of the day, our job is to really make sure that our customers get what they need, right? And that has to do with safe, reliable, affordable type of electricity. And at the same time, give them the flexibility and freedom to adopt whatever they need to, whatever they would like to do, right? So we're working towards that. Now that I'm in the parent company, the focus is a little bit different. We're looking at opportunities to, continue to look at growth of the company. And this whole technology space is a very interesting one for us. So when I participate in an event like this and hear some of the ideas that folks have, I always find that extremely interesting, refreshing, different perspectives. So I'm going to really enjoy the panel today.
Actually, I want to just, before I introduce Jan or have Jan introduce herself, there's one thing I just want to make clear that for folks who don't know, both Dan and Doug work for the corporate entities of the utilities. So right now, these guys, Dan doesn't work for PG&E Utility, he works for PG&E Corporate. Similarly, Doug works for Edison International Corporate, not SoCal Edison, the utility. The difference there is that the utility are regulated by the state. The parent companies are under a different set of constraints that they'll get to later, and their objectives are actually different yet aligned with the utility. Did I say that all correctly?
Yeah, I would say I work on both utilities.
Both utilities,
and
okay.
corporate.
So we'll get to that. So, right, I mean, Edison International you'll see in different places. Pacific Gas and Electric Corporate basically only has one entity underneath it, which is PG&E. So good fun. All right, Jan, please, for a completely different model.
Something completely different. First of all, thank you for choosing to come to this seminar this afternoon. That's what we're all about, community choice. I'm Jan Pepper. I'm the CEO of Peninsula Clean Energy. We're the community choice aggregator for San Mateo County. And yay, our slide is up there. So I'm just going to give you a quick background on what community choice energy is. First of all, how many of you here are familiar with the concept? Oh, okay, most of you. But a few hands didn't go up, so in order not to embarrass those of you who aren't too familiar with it, I'll give you a quick overview. Community choice energy was started actually in 2002 by a bill that was passed in the California legislature, which allows cities, counties, or cities and counties to aggregate their electric load and source the power for their residential and commercial customers. And in San Mateo County, what we've done is formed a joint powers authority of all of the 20 cities in San Mateo County, as well as the county, to form Peninsula Clean Energy. We filed an implementation plan with the Public Utilities Commission, which says that, basically lays out our plan, and we're able to go ahead and source the power for our customers. So as you can see in this slide, we're kind of the first circle up there. We are in charge of the electric generation and sourcing that electric generation. It is then delivered to all of our customers over PG&E's distribution system. PG&E still maintains the distribution system. If the lights go out, if a tree falls on a power line, you still call PG&E. They're the ones who'll fix it. They still send out the bills, and they still have a customer service group. We also have a customer service group that answers questions about Peninsula Clean Energy. So basically it's a partnership where we are sourcing the electricity. In the utility model, the procurement of power is supposedly a pass-through, or PG&E would procure the power and then pass those costs directly through to the customers. So in theory, they shouldn't really care that we're now taking over that procurement step. So we have a board of directors composed of 22 people. There's a council member from each of the 20 cities and 2 of the county supervisors, and they are our governing board. And we have public meetings every month. It's on the 4th Thursday of the month. You're all welcome to come to our board meetings. They're quite interesting. And we set our own rates. We enter into power purchase agreements, and we provide energy programs that serve our local area. So it's all about local choice. It's about giving customers the choice of a different electricity provider than PG&E. The way the law is set up, everyone is automatically opted in to Peninsula Clean Energy. They can choose to opt out and stay with PG&E if they so choose. We have tried to put together a product offering that makes it compelling to stay with us. Namely, our default product, which we call Eco Plus, is 50% renewable energy and 80% greenhouse gas free, and it's priced at 5% below PG&E's generation rates. So it saves a typical residential customer about $2 a month. We also have an opt-up product, which is 100% renewable, 100% GHG free, which is about 5% more than PG&E's generation product, so about $2 a month more for a residential customer. We're happy to say that we started enrolling customers in October of 2016, and in April we completed the rollout throughout all of San Mateo County. So now every resident and business in San Mateo County has become a Peninsula Clean Energy customer, unless they've opted out, and we're proud to say that our opt-out rate has been extremely low. We've had about 1.5% of our customers opting out, so that's pretty much a record for the community choice energy space. We are the 5th CCA that started in California. The first was Marin Clean Energy, then Sonoma Clean Power, Lancaster Choice Power in Southern California, Clean Power SF, and now us. And in Santa Clara County, if you live here, Silicon Valley Clean Energy is your CCA, and they are in the process of enrolling their customers right now. We also have a net energy metering program where we pay our net metered customers a penny per kilowatt hour in addition to the retail rate for any excess generation that they produce, which is more than what they would get from PG&E. So we want to encourage local generation, even though it's maybe not the most economical thing to do, to encourage our solar customers or encourage solar by paying them more. Part of our whole thing is about local control, local resources, and encouraging local resources here. Our goals for our strategic goals that our board has set include reaching 100% GHG free by 2021, being 100% California eligible renewable by 2025 and having 20 megawatts of local renewable resources in San Mateo County by, can't remember the year, 2025 maybe, 2022, I can't remember, pretty soon. So I will stop there and hand it over to Lorenzo.
Okay.
Thanks. So Lorenzo is a different entity, even entirely from what we've been talking about. Go ahead, and I'll put up the
Hold off on the slide for a moment. Okay. I thought it would be useful to give everyone a 2-minute crash course on what's happening to the electric system and the industry today and how it's changing, just to kind of get us all on the same page. Traditionally, the electric power system is structured as big generating plants, gas, coal, not coal in California, but gas, coal, nuclear, and hydro, and whatever other new, but they're large-scale entities. They're attached to a high-voltage transmission grid, which is like a big mesh network. It's all one big system. And in the western region, the western states, it's all connected. It's all one piece that goes into parts of Canada and parts of northern Mexico, as well as all the western states. And then at the next level down is what we call the distribution system, and these are typically radial wires. They're like the local streets and roads that take the energy out to the end-use customers. Traditionally, it's been one way. Big central station power plants, it runs around on the transmission grid, it goes out the distribution wires, and it goes to the customers at the end. Now, in that structure, what I do, I work for the California Independent System Operator. We were created in 1998 under state legislation, but pursuant to federal law that was enacted to create competitive wholesale markets for power plants, essentially to be able to compete to sell their output. And that's part of the reason why we have I in our name, which is independent, and that is we run the high voltage transmission system for the combined territories of PG&E, Southern California Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric, and a number of smaller municipals that are inside that same footprint. But we also run the wholesale markets. And so by independent, we have to be unaffiliated with any of the entities that buy and sell wholesale power through that market system. Now, the thing that's really upsetting the entire industry at this point is, number one, renewable energy at transmission level on the grid, because renewable energy, wind and solar, what it produces depends on what the sun and what the wind are doing, where those resources are located. And so we're used to traditionally a system where we control everything. We give it dispatch instructions and tell it what to do. You can't tell these other resources what to do. It's like, you know, telling your cat to lie down or not go out or whatever. They'll look at you and they'll do what they want. So that's one. But the second major upset that's happening is what we call distributed resources, or distributed energy resources, or DER. And in the jargon, I use that term to mean anything that's connected below the transmission grid. It's on the distribution wires somewhere. It could be connected directly to a utility facility, utility wire, or it could be on the customer side of the meter. All of that stuff is DER. And the reason why we keep it broad and general is because it's fundamentally anything that's happening down on that level is going to change the way the system operates. And just as a point of fact, this integrated system from the west-wide interconnection of all the states run by 38 different entities, including the ISO, all the way down to the end-use customer is one big machine. It's got to be balanced supply and demand 24/7 every minute, and if it departs for a few seconds, it can cause a disturbance, and if it departs more than that, it can cause a big disturbance. And a lot of the way the grid is operated is a disturbance in one place can essentially proliferate and affect a large area, as has happened at a few times in recent history. So we've got to think about then the whole system and how it operates. With DER growing, what this means is, instead of having a handful of big power plants that we're controlling, now we're at a point where all of these devices, some of them behind the meter, some of them on the grid, a mixture of diversity of resources, charging station and rooftop solar and all those other things, they're behaving in a whole lot of different ways. And what happens in one part of the system affects the rest of the system. So how do we manage then in that environment? And so my job, I work in the Market and Infrastructure Policy Group at the ISO, and for about the last 7, 8 years, I've been focusing on how do we change the rules for what the ISO does to accommodate this new world, to be able to operate a reliable grid, to be able to sustain fairly stable wholesale markets, in a world where there's lots more renewable generation on the grid, which is not so controllable, and then there's all of this stuff coming up from the bottom, a bottom-up transformation in distributed resources and customer side or grid edge devices. How do we transform that system? So using that as a takeoff place, I want to sort of bring to your attention what I think are some really important issues that technology needs to address. And if you want to throw up the curve now.
Yeah, one thing that, just to pinpoint something you said earlier, was that some of the changes coming from DER and renewable is upsetting the system. Just to be clear, you don't mean upsetting as making them frustrated. You mean upsetting in terms of making the balancing process more challenging.
Yes, that, but I guess what I mean even more is it's just upsetting the traditional paradigm.
Right.
It's a revolution in how electric systems work.
Right.
So it's really,
And that said,
I don't mean emotionally upsetting,
I
right?
just want to make sure that's clear. But right.
Although it does some of that too. you know,
Right,
some-
well, right, because
yeah.
it's a totally new paradigm. Okay, I'm going
Right.
to put up.
Okay.
Who here knows what the duck curve is? All right, we got a good
Okay,
audience here.
so a lot of you know that. So good. So the reason why I wanted to start with this, for again, to try and get everyone on the same page, but also to realize that, this curve was created a few years ago, 2013 or 2014, I think we first came out with this, because we have actual data for 2012 and 13. But then the brown lines below that are projections of what's going to happen. So the blue lines at top tell you what does the load curve look like. This is 24 hours across the horizontal axis at the bottom. What does the load shape look at the ISO system level? After you take out rooftop solar. Rooftop solar is not in this picture, okay? So what comes to the ISO, if it's behind the meter rooftop solar, we don't see any of that. But then you take all the utility scale generation and you take out its impact. Solar primarily is the big impact here, and you get those successive load shapes, the brown curves, that over the years with more and more solar, because it's generating in the middle of the day and then it's cutting off in the early evening, and it's gradually decreasing in the late afternoon hours, what you see is the belly of the duck in the middle, where there's a whole lot of excess supply that we don't necessarily need because it's not being consumed. And then there's a really steep increase in load that goes up into the late afternoon. And then there's a peak that happens at top, and where the peak occurs, typically there isn't any solar power, especially as we're seeing more recently the peak moving to after 6 p.m., 7 p.m. even in some instances. So what I want to, the perspective I want to put here, or actually click it a couple more times because there's two little blue bubbles that come up. And the blue bubble, the first one here, the bottom one, net load of 10,300 on April 9th, 2017. So that first blue dot at the bottom is something that occurred in 2017, which way exceeded our projection for 2020. That's how fast the increase of solar energy on the grid is having an impact. And then the ramp up in the late afternoon, 13,000 was the steepest that we, again, projected as part of the 2020 curve. We experienced that in December 2016. So a reason for thinking about this is that this, in a sense, represents the operational challenges of high volumes of solar. And unless we solve it, it creates a potential barrier to the rapid increase of solar energy on the grid. And when we think of rapid increase of solar energy, it's not just utilities buying solar power plants It's not just people putting solar on their roofs, it's also electrification of the rest of the economy. In order to deal with greenhouse gas, we need to electrify transportation, we need to electrify heating that uses gas, and a whole lot of other processes. So we're simultaneously increasing the demand for energy, but meeting more and more of it with solar. How do we do that in a way that instead of creating this curve, creates a flatter profile? And I would say there's not one answer. There's a dozen or 15 or 20 different strategies for how to do this. One of the things I'll mention goes back to DER and local possibilities. And if you put up the next slide.
Yeah, actually, we get to that in a little bit. I want to
Okay.
just actually want to engage panel for a second.
Okay.
So Jan, what does the duck curve mean to you? I guess that's the easiest way of asking.
What does the duck curve mean to me? Well, for us, there's a couple things. One of the things is that what's going on in the wholesale markets, and when the belly of the duck gets really low like that, wholesale prices fall dramatically. They can even go to zero, or they can even be negative. So if you have a solar facility that's generating, you might have to pay the ISO to take that power because they don't really want it. But there's a disconnect because retail rates are inverse. So retail rates right now are still higher in the afternoon because it's reflecting what happened back in 2010 when we wanted people to not use as much power during the day and we wanted to use it at night. Like if you have an electric car, who here has an electric car? Probably half the room will raise their hands. People plug in their car and they have it start charging at midnight. Well, how about, if the retail rates reflected the wholesale market, we would encourage people to plug their cars in from noon to 4. So it's that kind of transition. As a CCA, we set our rates to mirror PG&E's rates in order to make it more simple for our customers to understand what our rates, and also because of some metering and billing issues that make it difficult for us to not follow PG&E's structure. So, altogether, we need to be changing the retail rates so that we provide the right economic incentive to help solve this problem. Certainly, there are technology things to solve it, but we can also provide economic incentives to encourage people to use power at those times that will help us match our supply to our load.
That's really helpful. So Doug and Dan, I don't need to lump you, but lumping you. I see two challenges here that utilities are going to respond to. One of them is for the generation you have, how do you actually deal with the steep ramping? And the other is how do you actually manage the net load? Very low load. Can you each talk about either pilot projects that you have or will do that address those?
Okay, so let me first start this way, though. When I look at this curve, right, there are infinite number of conversations you could have about any number of things, whether it's the market structure, the policy framework, right pricing, right incentives, right technology. You can have these conversations all day long, and all of them will be valid conversations. But the first thought that comes to my mind is, wow, what a terribly inefficient way for the society to invest its money, right? When the pricing becomes negative, you're paying somebody to actually go consume something, right? And this has happened in other countries, right? Germany, I mean, you actually pay people to go consume things. So I think there's probably the right way to manage these things, but that's going to be multiple solutions.
And different timelines.
And different timeline. But fundamentally, to address your earlier point, right, there are a number of technologies, and I'm going to stick with the technology for a moment because we've had years of experimentation, demonstration, and solutions because, as probably we all did, we could see these things coming. There were other countries that have experienced this thing before we did, and even just the logic will say, you know what, this sort of inefficient usage, unless the investment that customers make and the investments that utility makes can be better co-optimized, we're going to see inefficient deployment of capital from societal perspective. How do you overcome that? Technology certainly is one of the key levers to help us manage that. So one of the things that we did, obvious thing that comes into mind is, hey, how about energy storage, right? Soak up the excess, encourage customers to charge electric cars through a smart charging regime. You can have things like a variable charging, and we have worked with a number of companies, large and small, startups, mid-size, big companies like some of the folks like GE and whatnot, for a lot of these things to better manage that sort of a software-driven, hardware-driven solutions, right? So I think there are solutions like that, but right now, the thing that is really attractive is storage, obviously, because we're talking about the amount of energy that needs to be shifted. Until recently, we were looking at storage mostly as a way of managing the volatility on the grid. So they didn't have to be really long duration, right? They were usually high power, short duration devices. When you look at something like this, right, it should be clear like, wow, I need at least 4 to 6 hours of energy. I need 1:4, 1:6 ratio now, power to energy. What is the right energy solution, right? Where do you put it? Do you put it at the bulk system? Because to get to the 50% target, maybe even higher, our thought is it's not all going to come from DER. There's no way. It's physically, there's a such thing as a law of physics, right? It's a lot of it's going to come from central renewables. And that's where some of the challenges and the solutions are going to have to be addressed, and that's a large systems. So we look at that, but we also look at what about small energy storage systems, and we've done some testing around this using 50 kilowatt hours or whatever, and then we actually put like refrigerator size storage in people's garages to see if that is more cost effective. No, it's not. From our experimentation, it's, I think, better at the community energy storage where you aggregate 10 homes, whatever. So there are a lot of different solutions. I think the point I'm trying to make is that there is a huge amount of room and opportunities for folks that can really think about these solutions in a creative way and not just apply what seems like obvious. Let's just go put some storage, right? Yes, but there are a lot of power electronics. There's a lot of different technologies that can be deployed to better manage this volatility.
Okay. So I think at its core, to address this duck curve issue, you have to either address or probably address both of demand and supply. And Doug, I think, was talking more about the supply side of that picture. So I'll kind of share a few thoughts on the demand side. When it comes to demand, what we're talking about is providing the right kind of incentives for customers to shift how they use energy. And that can be done either through pricing or programs that we offer. But I think the first thing to keep in mind is that unlike this audience, the vast majority of PG&E's customers are not spending a lot of time thinking about their energy usage. And I think the vast majority of those people still believe that they should avoid using energy in the middle of the day. That was a signal that California sent to people very loudly and prominently in the early 2000 period when we had a shortage of energy. And our experience is it takes a very long time to get people to think differently and to understand that the energy system has changed in significant ways. So, as we've looked to change rate structures, for example, Jan talked about this a little bit, those changes are going to occur very gradually and probably require testing different kinds of price structures with some customers on an optional basis while keeping the rest of our customers on a rate and price structure that's very similar to what they have today. We are looking to really find ways in which we can successfully shift demand, either based off of the time of the day or the specific grid needs in a particular location. And I'd like to give a couple of examples. One example is where we at PG&E, we manage demand response and energy efficiency programs. And we have a program where we look out at the distribution system and try and identify where we may have operational issues, capacity needs, the need to kind of expand a substation potentially for additional capacity. And what we've done is used the smart meter data that we have access to identify which customers get fed from that particular location, and then target specific energy efficiency programs at those customers to get to achieve perhaps a reduction in their peak usage, which will then allow us to avoid the need for a grid investment. So, that's an example of a kind of program that we're targeting to encourage customers to shift behavior or invest in something to benefit the grid. Another example is around electric vehicles. We had a smart charging pilot program with BMW, and in that program, BMW signed up 100 of their customers, and between the customer load from those electric vehicles and the use of some second life batteries, they were able to commit 100 kilowatts of capacity whenever PG&E called on it, whenever we needed it. And they did that by combining both smart charging of the vehicle. So if the vehicle was connected to the grid and charging at a point in time when we needed a capacity, then the signal was sent to the drivers, and if the driver approved, the charging was stopped for a period of time, and the car was charged later in the day when that capacity wasn't needed. In the event that we didn't have enough capacity from the vehicles directly, then we filled up that gap from the second life batteries. And I think those are examples of ways in which we're looking to smooth out the load that Lorenzo talked about, and have a more dynamic system that can kind of address some of these issues.
So I think everyone's talked on technology, and Jan, you touched on really the concept of engagement with customers. One thing I'd like to just kind of shift the conversation to really focus on investment and innovation, and trying to identify, given the challenges that we're facing with DER, especially here in California, what are the opportunities for investment, either from a more corporate standpoint or more from a more white space, green field kind of investment? And Lorenzo, you've had some ideas about this, like what the market needs to do. What do you think is the top 7 things? I gave you a very wide berth there, because if you want to rattle off the list, that's fine. If you think it's just
okay.
one thing, clearly you heard from storage is key. But what
Sure. So I want to make a couple of points to just pick up on these last comments, and I'm not avoiding your question. I'm just setting it up. As I mentioned earlier about the electrical system being a whole system, transmission and distribution, and what happens in one part affects all the others. Another way to think about the entire electric system is also as a set of layers, where you've got distribution wires and transmission wires. You have the electrical connections that tie everything together. But on top of that, you have a communication system where you're getting information about what's happening in different places. And then you have control systems where you send signals and it tells certain parts of the system to do something. Instructions we send to power plants. And on top of that, you have a market where you have economic signals, price signals. And this gets to the investment, because markets were thought, when FERC and Congress invented this in the 90s, that if you have independent parties buying power plants, you're going to get a better, more efficient investment climate, because now they're responding to market signals. That's part of the whole system. Then you have a regulatory structure that prices things, that guarantees rates of returns to regulated entities and things like that. And then on top of that, you have federal laws and so on. And then there's customer behavior and communities. All of these things make up a system, and if you make a change in one place, it affects what happens in other places. So back to your question about investment, there are certain things where the regulatory framework can help the investment framework. And part of that comes back to, let's show the next slide if you don't mind, because what this curve shows you is the demand curve after all the behind-the-meter rooftop solar is taken off. But here's what's actually behind that. We now have about 6,000 megawatts of rooftop solar in California, in the middle of the graph here. It's going to double in the next 6 years. The peak load at the ISO system is under 50,000 megawatts or 50 gigawatts. So 12,000 megawatts of rooftop solar is 25% of our peak load, but the solar keeps generating even when we're way below peak, so it's an even bigger share there. Now, back to that duck curve idea, it's made up of lots of ducklings. People haven't talked about ducklings to now, but I think we need to, because you take a circuit, a distribution circuit where there's lots of houses and lots of rooftops and it's sunny and they have lots of rooftop solar installed, you replicate that same duck curve shape at the local level. And currently, all of that extreme load profile, not to mention moment-to-moment volatility, that's another characteristic, all that gets exported up to the ISO, and we have to manage it at the ISO level, which we typically do by relying, at least for the time being, on gas plants, because they're dispatchable, they're controllable, we can get them to do what we want. And so there's this tension of wanting to get off of fossil fuels, but you take something like net energy metering, which has been great to incentivize rapid expansion of solar, but if you have net energy metering, your incentive is dump all your excess energy onto the grid, use the grid as a battery, get it back when you need it late afternoon, drive up that neck of the duck and the peak load. Add to that the fact that when we talk about investment in infrastructure, peak load typically drives investment. We build the capacity of the grid and even the capacity of distribution circuits to meet the peak load that's expected, which means that 99.9% of the time, you're not fully utilizing the capacity. So a whole regulatory framework and investment climate potentially exists around creating flatter load profiles, especially at the distribution circuit level. When I first started talking about this, I would talk about flattening the ducklings, and that made a lot of people kind of squeamish about, oh, these poor little babies, you don't flatten them. So, let's talk about smoothing them. But how do we create incentives with net energy metering where the incentive is in the wrong direction? We would like to create an incentive to say, no, let's smooth that duckling shape at the local level and not export it up to the ISO where we're going to essentially have to manage it with greenhouse gases. For example, if we try to change a law to eliminate net energy metering, there's 6,000 megawatts of investment that people have made that say, well, wait a minute, we invested and we expected the rates to stay the same, the time of use periods to stay the same for the next 15 years. You can't change that on us now. Well, what if we subsidize a battery for them? What if, we take some funds from the state, we figure out where to get it, because after all, money is, you just make it up and print it, right? So, and buy people batteries that essentially provide the same financial benefits as net energy metering. And now all of a sudden you have a smooth profile. And all I'm getting at is technologies, creative regulatory frameworks, creative policies that the legislature could enact can begin to address the duck curve in that way. And I think it's that combination. How do we get the policy and the technologies aligned, but focus on what's the problem we're trying to solve? We want to electrify everything. We want lots of solar energy. We want to get a really clean power system. And the way we're going about it is creating these ducklings and the duck. So what do we do about that? How do we change it in a way that people are willing to go along with, because they're not financially harmed when we change the paradigm or the pricing paradigm? And I think technology can provide answers to that.
That's helpful. So Jan, when it comes to investing, what would you advise people who are interested in trying to solve some of these challenging problems?
Well, I think there's a couple things. And so one of the things we can do, being a local agency, is that we can work with some of those ducklings and work with the ISO or PG&E to talk to our customers who have solar and incent them to shift the production with storage. And one of the other things that we're interested in, all of the cities that are part of PCE are interested overall in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They have all passed climate action plans for their communities as part of the effort of the state to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So by being part of an entity that reduces the GHG content of the electricity, they're moving on a good path to meeting their climate action goals. But as it turns out, transportation is one of the largest contributors to GHG emissions. So if we can get people to transition to electric vehicles instead of gasoline vehicles, then that will help as well. And as you were talking, my thought was, well, what if we incent, if you want to incent people to put batteries in, how about those batteries be in their electric vehicles? And have this kind of mobile storage system that's out there that can go both ways right now. Right now, you can't go both ways with the electric vehicle battery. I understand that the technology is there to do it. It's just that it's not set up to do that. So can we pay people to draw power from their EV battery at certain times of the day, and then we'll pay them to store that electricity in their batteries at other times of the day. So we could maybe solve two things at the time. We can smooth out those little ducklings, and which we love. We won't eat any of the ducks. We'll just smooth them out, and then we'll have this mobile storage facility as well. So one of the things we're really interested in as a CCA is that because we're small, we can do things quickly, we can pilot projects quickly, and these are the kinds of things that we're hoping to be able to do to help kind of advance the knowledge and adoption of new technologies.
So I want to get to Doug in a second, but when you say you can do pilots, does that mean are you working with startups or working with technology companies to iterate small test pilots, or is it something that is really more of a desktop exploration?
Well, we just launched, okay?
What results?
So we're a startup public agency, but now that we are serving all of our customers, there's a lot of emphasis and excitement about adopting energy programs. So that's what we're looking at right now, and so we're interested in talking to startup companies or those who have technology that they might want to test. A number of our board members have come from the technology world. They're luminaries in their fields, and they're very interested in having us be a test bed of innovation.
That's really great to think about a test bed there.
Can I add one comment? Sure. Just make one point that I wanted to end up with and forgot. It's important to realize that this function of being able to flatten ducklings at the local level is tremendously valuable. But there is no revenue stream where somebody can make money doing it. It doesn't exist yet. And that's really part of the problem. For investors to think about investing in facilities or systems or whatever that are going to smooth out the load curve at the local level, there's no way really to get paid for that yet. And I think that falls into the legislative or regulatory framework to figure out how to do that. It's the same thing applies to microgrids and local resilience. We talk about batteries and being able to provide resilience at the community level. There's no place in a cost-benefit assessment to plug in the value of resilience. That hasn't been figured out yet. And so we have things that we can say, yes, this is really valuable, but there's no way yet for somebody to make money doing it.
So let me just turn that a little bit, meaning that if there were regulations or legal constructs that valued resilience and valued smoothnicity, I'm making up that word there, that could then create markets to organize around.
That's right.
Okay.
And then that would create investment opportunities.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So given that, both you guys have been talking about ways that you're investing in corporations investing in both different entities. Can you just share some of what you've been doing?
Yeah, so it's actually what Jen was talking about resonated with me, right? This whole notion of greenhouse gas reduction, right? As a company, what we are really trying to focus on is to support that. And I think to your point, there are a lot of things that we can invest in to manage the power sector, right? Do a better job around things like this, around cleaning up our energy content more and so forth, right? And that's our fairly traditional role. And so we focus on that. What's interesting to us right now is this whole notion about transportation, right? Because to your point, when you actually look at the sources of these greenhouse gas, there's I forget exactly what the ratio is, but there's a lot that comes from transportation. I might even say it's actually way bigger than power sector, and there's a huge opportunity. And not only that, there are now, because of the storage and some of the technologies that are being developed, there's a real opportunity for companies to focus on investing in some of those transportation technologies. For us, it's obviously, we are not going to invest directly in the cars themselves, because there are plenty of folks who know how to do that better than we can. But what we can invest in, what we can address, is the infrastructure that can really reduce some of the customer barriers that exist today for people to adopt these things, like the range anxieties and things that you hear about, lack of availability in charging, and some of the issues that gets created by people charging during unwanted times and so forth. So I think there's a plenty of investment opportunities that we can make as a power company to encourage adoption of the electric transportation.
So what you're talking about also is getting into how comfortable is it for an entity like Edison to get into the transportation consumer side of it? I mean, that's not your native domain.
Yeah, well, from a utility perspective, that's somewhat true, because we have actually, like you mentioned, a lot of programs that are facing customers and a lot of demand response, energy efficiency things. But at the parent company level, right, public information, because we've done this a while ago, we have made some investments in an electric bus company, right? Because what we really want to do is encourage formation and development of some of those type of enterprises at the private level, not just driven by policy. I do believe that while we may need a lot of policy encouragement today to get that greenhouse gas reduction going, get more renewables in place, eventually, at some point in time, the market will have to stand it up based on its merits, right? So we're just helping to pave, and by us getting involved in making some of those active investments in formation of those things that are beyond our traditional utility boundary, we have also invested in companies that do C&I solar development, right? We have invested in companies that do off-site renewable contracts for C&I customers. So we are focusing, and we'll continue to do so, on the other side of the utility. Because like my earlier thesis, I think it just takes both investments to do a better job in optimizing in order to create better value. It's not a zero-sum game, right? I think it's just something to keep in mind.
So Dan, can you talk about what PG&E's been doing and what the roadmap looks like for you?
Yeah. So I'd say PG&E is much more active and more focused on utility, on investments within the utility side of our business than on the unregulated side. We've done less over the last few years than Edison has. We see tremendous opportunity to invest within the utility. One thing to just build off of Doug's comments around electric vehicles. We have a program that we're just rolling out now, as do the other California utilities, looking to build out the charging infrastructure in California. That's obviously one of the key requirements for us as a state to really remove any barriers from EV adoption more broadly, is to ensure that there is enough charging infrastructure and enough workplace infrastructure. Because when we think about using vehicles as a balancing resource, you really need to have charging. We have this need, that duck curve need in the middle of the day that's when cars should be charging. But if cars are parked somewhere where they can't be charging in the middle of the day, then they can't be used as a resource. So that's a big part of our focus. I'd also say, electric vehicles today are largely concentrated around light duty vehicles, and in the medium and heavy duty, there's certainly a lot of potential for battery powered electric vehicles, but there's also some uncertainty about energy density and ability to use batteries in those heavy duty vehicles. And there, I think there's an opportunity for the utility to look at encouraging other forms of clean transportation. So that could be the use of hydrogen or fuel cell vehicles, could be CNG or LNG, could be any number of things. And those are things that we're looking to pilot and test as well. And I think the last thing I'd highlight is, today, we see, in large part because of the success of solar as a renewable resource, we've seen such widespread adoption. And Lorenzo has kind of helped to highlight some of the challenges that poses. There's no doubt that California is going to continue to decarbonize our electric system. And so we're going to need to continue to add more renewables to the system. So over the longer term, I would like to think there will be continued investment in other forms of renewable resources that today can't compete with the raw cost of solar on a cents per kilowatt hour basis. But when you factor in the overall cost and value to the system at a point in time when we have, when any new solar that you add has to be paired with a battery, well, then that a point in time may come where other forms of renewables, wave energy, hydrogen, other resources that today, maybe are not, being tested all that widely, those could really help to solve the overall puzzle and fill out the picture that we've been describing here.
So this has been great to hear your take on investing. What I'd like to do is open it up to the audience, get some questions. You were first, and you can either direct it to someone in particular or panel in general, and then I might play them off each other. We'll see how it goes. Sure.
I'm Laura Park from Artemis Water Strategy, and I'd like to ask PG&E and SCE to just address and I guess I would be interested to hear any negatives around it, the demand response opportunities with wastewater facilities. The state, throughout the state, the largest user of electricity in most of these smaller and medium-sized towns are the wastewater facilities, and they don't need to work 24/7. They're very specific systems that need biological processes 24/7. In most cases, no one's asked for new technologies that can enable these systems to work in response, and it's a pretty straightforward thing. Have you guys looked at the potential there? Are there downsides that we're not seeing yet?
I can't really talk specifically to that, to wastewater facilities. But I will say that we have across the system there are lots of different customers that use energy on different profiles. So I think it points to the fact that ultimately we need to move to more dynamic rate structures. Right today, I think PG&E has somewhere around 300 tariffs, so 300 different rate structures that customers go on, and we need some way to, in a sense, simplify that, but yet expand it and make it more dynamic.
Is this a real low-hanging fruit? These are facilities that are run by engineers, and they know how to time these things correctly. Wouldn't this be like an initial priority?
Well, again, if they have the ability to dynamically change their load, hopefully they have an economic incentive, and they should be doing it anyway. It's not something that PG&E or the utilities can necessarily control. What we want to do is provide the right kind of economic signals, and then empower people to move their load, if they're able to provide that better, flatter load curve or more dynamic load that the system needs.
I think your question actually echoes back to something that Lorenzo was saying, which is that not everything that the grid needs to optimize DER is going to make money.
Well, but in this case, there are structures in the ISO market. There are aggregators out there who work with demand, different types of demand structures, who aggregate them and create wholesale market resources. So I'm surprised that they haven't gone to the wastewater treatment facilities and try to pick them up as customers, because I know that the parties that pump water supply and irrigation and so on, many of them are able to either aggregate or, if they're big enough individually, participate. They might not be big enough individually. We have a 0.5 megawatt capacity threshold, but or actually it's less than that. It's 1/10 of a megawatt for demand response. So there are structures in the ISO market, and if you want, I'll give you a card later. You can write to me and we can follow up on it.
So let's take another question. It was, yes, sir.
Thank you. Earlier you mentioned that you mentioned the disconnect between retail rates and wholesale rates, and the issue of how currently electric vehicle chargers as well as other fuels are encouraged to use energy at night when it's cheaper, even though we have more solar energy than electric. And so I actually work on this specific issue, and I'm wondering what are the prospects for addressing it so that our retail rates are more reflective of the market.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for many years, decades, we've been talking about real-time pricing, and maybe for really large companies, they are able to do real-time pricing, but I'm not even sure that's happening. But it's really, trying to make more of a connection between the wholesale prices and the retail prices, and it's for the utilities and everyone else to get on board with that. So I think someone said, I'm not sure if it was Doug or Dan who said it's going to be a number of years before the retail rates change so that they are more reflective of wholesale rates. Why can't we do it now?
That's a trick question, by the way.
I'm not sure why I took the mask, this thing here.
I wasn't supposed to ask the question.
But okay, I can try to address some of these. You asked a question about EB rates, right? I do remember. So not that long ago, and we still have it, our residential customers, right? The rates were designed a long time ago to just generally reduce consumption, total consumption, right? Regardless of time of use, when they actually use it. It was just encouraged to get more energy efficiency, people to consume less, so that we don't have to build as many, at the time, gas plants, right? Because that's how we provided the supply. And it worked, right? California is one of the most energy efficient per capita, right, state in the country. So that worked. But things are changing now, right? So in order to reduce the greenhouse gas, we really want to encourage electric cars, but they consume a ton of electricity. And they tend to consume it at all hours, random hours. And when we design electric only, PEV only TOU rate, at that time, we did not see the degree of challenges that we're seeing today, because that rate was in place 7-8 years ago, right? So now we're looking at TOU rate that more correctly reflects the true cost and benefits of the consumption and the generation, right? And there lies in the challenge of getting the wholesale price down to the retail price, right? Wholesale price kind of reflects, right, the most economic use of resources and values different resources. At the retail play, you don't have the visibility because you're not literally talking about neighborhoods. You don't know exactly what your position is exactly so that you can accurately have the real-time pricing. But in the meantime, until we have the technology, sensing, communicating, decision-making that can automate a lot of these things, and then therefore price things appropriately, like, hey, if you give me a megawatt between this hours at this location, it's worth this much, right? You're getting to the granular, you're getting into time and space problem. Time's really short, space is really small. How do you accurately price that in the real time? Eventually, probably, but for now, I think we can try to address a lot of those issues through things like demand charge, like time of use, to use energy more efficiently at the right time.
So actually, who here knows how rates are set in California? All right, that's something we can answer. Who wants to take that one on? Because it is very confusing. Actually, I don't think it's, Doug just said it's arcane.
But actually,
Right.
I mean, I do have something to say, though, in response to your question. I mean, as Doug was talking about, at Peninsula Clean Energy, we could start a pilot real-time pricing program for EV charging, for example. We could, as long as we use the same hours, basically, that PG&E has set up for any time of use program, because we aren't able to get more granular data than what PG&E currently does through their metering. Our part of the bill is only a portion of the bill. We're about half of the bill because we're the generation side of the bill. So we could reduce the generation rate to, 1 cent per kilowatt hour or something in the afternoon, but PG&E still bills for the delivery portion, which is the other half of the bill, and unless they change that, it would provide some incentive. If we could work with PG&E to reduce the other side of the bill and see how it works, that's something we could do.
Yeah, well, okay, does PG&E set the rates?
Good question. So there's things that we can test in pilots, and pilots are a good way for us to kind of test new things. When it comes to rates and rate structures, no, we don't get to decide how we think the rate structure should be established. There was a process that we went through at the Utility Commission a couple of years ago that took a couple of years, that involved literally dozens of different stakeholders, and there were a number of changes that the PG&E wanted to see happen to rate structures, but ultimately the people who advocate on behalf of customers, the ratepayer type advocates, they have some fundamental principles that they hold dear, and some of them are what Doug was referring to, that we still want to have inclining rates to encourage the energy efficiency programs that we have within the state. They also don't want to see rate structures changing in dramatic ways without a very lengthy process to educate customers on how those changes will be rolled out. So for one example, a fairly fundamental change, time of use rates, which allow us to charge customers different rates at different times of the year and different times of the day, that will be mandatory, or customers will have to opt out of that. They'll be defaulted into that rate structure, but only starting in 2019. So this was a decision that was, this is residential customers. Right, yeah. So for residential customers, we have a 3-year period just to roll out the time of use rates. And then to kind of to think about then moving to more dynamic pricing. I'm sure it's on the roadmap, so to speak, but it's not something that PG&E could do unilaterally, or something that's likely to happen, within the next few years as a requirement. Now, you can have pilots again, and maybe we should explore a way to try and do this on a pilot basis. But more broadly speaking, rate structures fundamentally for one of the principles is to keep them simple and easy to understand. And I think what the key enabler will be a point in time when technology takes the human factor out of understanding rates. So when you can, for example, program your dishwasher, your washing machine, your EV, and those appliances can operate independently of you needing to understand that CAISO has just called critical peak pricing, and you should be dropping your load, or that there's a need for capacity because we're deep in the belly of the duck. I think it's a point in time when those resources, those appliances can be made smart and receive signals that we can really have some of the programs that we've been talking about.
So I think,
Can I just add a point to that?
I want you to give your comment, and then we'll take one more question. I just wanted to...
Okay, the main thing I wanted to say is that retail rate making is very much a political problem, and it's a great opportunity for those of you who want to get into that realm and think about it, because it's stuck in the 20th century. It moves at the speed of continental drift, and there's been a substantial constituency forever that has opposed dynamic retail rates. It's totally political. And so, you know, the upsetting that I mentioned earlier, this is sort of the emotional side of it, you know. There are people that get really upset about what technology is doing because the old rate structures are breaking down. And the evidence of that was increased behind-the-meter rooftop solar, and the utilities concerned about revenues and how do we recover the cost of our assets because we're not selling as many kilowatt hours. Well, that's a problem, but it's a problem of an archaic rate structure. Anyway, anybody who's so inclined, great opportunities to come up with something creative and new here.
So you have a question. You seem very eager, so you get the last word here.
I hope this question is phrased correctly. I mean, I'm trying to write it down so I say it correctly. Basically, like, so given that clean energy, the demand is higher than ever right now, right? People want their CCAs being launched. How do we deal with the, I guess, trade-off between how long it takes to actually develop new renewable sources, actually building new ones, and this concept of like offsets, RECs, and additionality? Do you see where my question is kind of going for? Like, how do we deal with things like, it's one thing to be carbon neutral, but are we actually causing a reduction in the environmental harm?
So looking beyond RECs,
Looking beyond RECs, looking beyond, like, there's RECs, there's offsets, and then there's, okay, is this actually additional? Is this actually causing a new renewable energy source to come online and inject into the overall grid?
so how do the markets actually drive
Right.
real reductions
Real
in carbon?
reductions in carbon, essentially.
Want me to take that?
Sure.
Well, one of the things that we're trying to do, I mean, certainly we're aware of that, and that's one of our objectives, is to build new renewables. And we actually signed a PPA for a new 200 megawatt solar project that will be built in Merced County. As a new entity, we have no credit rating, so it's, you know, initially we need to just contract with resources that are already existing. And so in terms of additionality, there's no additionality, but on the other hand, you also want to keep those resources, those renewable resources that have been built, you want to keep those operating, because if they don't have a market and they fall away, then you're not really doing, you know, you're not helping to grow the system. So there's two things that I think people need to be aware of, that there's nothing wrong with contracting with an existing resource because that resource needs a market, and then, of course, bringing on new renewables for the additionality.
So at this time, I want to just stop. I want to thank everyone for coming. Can we give the panel a round of applause?